Thank you. And thank you for inclusion in this session this afternoon. And I'd just like to acknowledge the welcoming to country from Larrakia this morning. Yes. I think I might actually just say that I'm incredibly nervous now that I am actually standing here. But maybe that'll help to just kind of get it out there and just and just shake it off or something. But I'm nervous because, and I've been steering a bit today, like sitting in my seat. But I'm nervous because all of you sitting here and the organising committee and essentially everybody in the programs are a very new audience for myself and the colleagues that I'm here on behalf of. You are a very expert group, very new expert group to meet and discuss. But then, certain glass half full take on life, that's kind of the point, yeah? So we're here to share and kind of discuss and maybe swap a few different perspectives. So there's not much less than to just either kind of jump in and just kind of see what you think. So I am here from the Noambata campus of James Cook University. And that's on near again to the Jabberwai lands or Cairns. I'm here on behalf just of a small group of people, small but really passionate about what we do in looking at the really long timescales of landscape changes. And so technically, this is a sort of a discipline known as paleoecology or paleoenvironmental science or paleofire, just paleo climate, and that's about as formal and as technical as I'm gonna get. So, So on that, so in thinking about some of the presentations, even just the beginning of this session and sort of early this morning, perhaps one way to translate that, or one way that you might like to view us, is that similar to, say, the Bureau and NAFI, we follow patterns in burning and we follow trends in climate, but that we work backwards in time from where their records begin. So, for example, where Peter's mentioned the 20 years for NAFI just now, and BOM, who may sort of go back 50 years or 100 years or so, we sort of try to pick that up and look back in those kind of multiple hundreds to thousands to sort of tens of thousands of years into the past on things like fire and vegetation patterns and climate. Our insights are not quite the same as the resolution or the mapping detail that you would see from people like the Bureau and NAFI, and indeed a lot of all those lovely maps that we've seen all throughout the day. But we do our best in that area, and what we do and our data is always kind of improving in that detail area. So this is mostly a sort of a methodological type sort of presentation, but I don't want to be sort of too mysterious about it. So I'm actually going to start with a few sort of examples so that you can get a picture of kind of the potential and what this kind of stuff can do. So not far from here, sort of literally down the road, is Girrawee Lagoon. And this space, so this lovely water body has revealed 150,000 years worth of history on those interactions between fire and vegetation and water and climate. And this is a really big scale story, yeah? So, it's really grand in time and space. We've got big shifts, a lot of drama, like a lot of interacting factors feeding into that really long scale sequence of information on a whole range of environmental changes. So Girraween is on Larrakia country, and it provides us with this really valuable background, kind of big contextual picture because of its grand scale. So this is a sort of a site that we often use to speak for sort of a greater space and perhaps on behalf of a number of sort of smaller sites. So a little bit differently is based in the Torres Strait with the Moor community and their interests and their investigations in their traditional island gardening practices. And this is a much more intimate scale look-see, and this is one that's looking in the role of fire in that land management, in the establishment of those very particular land management systems. It's looking at the role of fire in terms of a very particular set of plant types. And so you've got this island space with this really unique land management system, and they're very interested in the history of that because it's going to sort of fits in with their aspirations for looking into the future and perhaps their own island-based coping systems with sort of future forecasting of climate change. So differently again is the country of the Mara families and the Limmen National Park in the Gulf country. So their questions there are focused towards sort of people's activities and movements across the land, the fire that comes with that, the plant systems that come with that. But we're looking at only the past 500 years. And this is because the interest there is that time window for European arrival. So they're very interested in the shifts that happened just around that time. So the past 500 years are just as important as the past 2,000, as they're just as important as the past 150,000 in terms of just giving a bit of insight and in terms of influencing where we are today and certainly where things may go tomorrow. So how does all this work? So what actually kind of has to happen? So, I mean, everyone in this room knows that different fires produce different impacts, that they'll leave behind these different marks on the landscape. So you can sort of consider these like a signature. Different fires produce and leave behind different types and different amounts of charcoal. Plants will react differently to different fires and they'll leave behind their own remains. And then on top of all this, you've got that kind of climate umbrella, and so that'll vary. And that will influence fire and plants, but it'll also help influence some of the chemical residues that that's sort of left behind in the soil. So once you have a one season's fire activity, and that'll leave its mark. But then the next year comes along, and it has its fire environment combination, and it'll leave its mark. So it has the new signature, and that new one buries the previous one. Then you get the next decades and the next 10 years worth of marks that'll bury the previous decade, and so on and so on. And it just sort of builds up. So eventually what's left behind are these layers of marks, and those layers of marks are really layers of information. And they sit on top of each other in this sort of time order. And it's actually wetland sites that are wetlands of all forms, which are particularly good at building up these layers, and they're also particularly good at this kind of safekeeping of these layers and from their sort of surrounding landscapes. And it's, can we get that video with? So it's the wetlands because it's their muddy sediments. So that sort of soft, wet sort of environment that helps the charcoal particles and say, for example, the pollen. So I've just given you an example of a plant fossil type. So that's pollen. That's a little photo of some eucalyptus pollen there. This is the type of environment that helps these fossil types preserve. So collecting it's a group effort. It's done by hand, so it's actually quite a low impact type of thing. It's quite portable. We often sort of carry a lot of our equipment in, and we use these corers of various kinds. So this is just sort of one example here. And so it's just a two-part thing. It has a barrel and a whole series of handles that you sort of attach onto it. So the barrel is pierced through the surface. We repeatedly do that, and you sort of end up with these columns of sediment, say 50 centimetres worth or maybe a metre. And importantly, this core barrel is able to keep everything neat and tidy and kind of in order. So it's not mixing up those different depths as it goes through, and importantly, therefore, it's not mixing up time. So these cores, we cut them up, we break them open, we cut them up, whole series of little samples. So we cut these cores up, and then to actually view those remains themselves, this is also quite a sort of straightforward series of steps. So we've cut up our core or our column, the mud samples, and then just mixed with household bleach. So no real sort of super fancy chemicals involved. And the bleach does exactly that. So it just takes the colour out of most of that mud sample, and then it leaves behind these charcoal pieces. So they're the ones that are left behind, and they're much easier to see. So everything's washed through the trap, but it's because it's all small, we look at it all under a microscope. So that's just an example of an end result bleach sample with some charcoal kind of particles through it. So here are just some more examples here taken from a whole range of study sites, different fire remains, different times, just a different example of what the charcoal remains like. And they all have their own sort of sets of interpretation. Again, if you're looking at pollen, and you're interested in past vegetation patterns, so about the relationship between different plants and fire, so what was burnt in the past, how much, what may have disappeared with fire changes, what may have regrown. If you're asking questions about the charcoal and you're asking questions about the past fire characteristics, you will want to ask about the patterns with which that charcoal became preserved. Is that because of fire's frequency, because of its severity? Is that because of fire's relationship with climate? If you are interested in climate and you are looking at some of those chemical residues left behind, you might have questions about past water availability or past evaporative stresses. You might be interested in the rainfall type. Was it derived from a cyclone, or was it kind of just regular rain? The amount of rain, its seasonality, and all of these sort of questions, through time. So this is my final slide with a bit of footage. So the overall sort of message here is that fire, plants and climate all have their own fossilised remains. Can we click on that one? Thanks. They all have their own fossil remains, and we can look at them most certainly in combination with other data and other knowledges. And the 20 years of NAFI data, for example, kind of merges in to what we see. What I've not mentioned so much is that fire's connection with people over long time scales, and certainly from what I've been listening and absorbing here so far, there's absolutely much partnership between people and fire. So while my colleagues and I do have this toolkit that could help with questions about fire in the deep past, we're not fire practitioners, and we're not around fire to use it and know it intimately like you guys are. So there is certainly, that leaves a bit of a gap behind in that people-fire relationship. So, what would be great is to find, these magical columns of sediment, have different emphases of interpretations in what we can find, and maybe some of what we do can feed into a bit of a framework about land management. And that's it from me. I do have little brochures, I might leave them on the front table if that's okay, that just explains that process. So thank you.